Years later, Emma stood beside her aging grandfather, George, at the edge of a quiet cemetery. The autumn breeze rustled the leaves of nearby trees, scattering golden and crimson hues across the ground. In front of them was a simple headstone bearing the name Daniel Harper. It had been many years since Emma first learned the truth about her father, but today felt different. Today, she wasn't just visiting his grave as someone searching for answers. She was there to honor him. George leaned heavily on his cane, his steps slower than they used to be, but his eyes still sparkled with wisdom and warmth. He glanced at Emma, noticing how much she had grown, not just physically, but emotionally. Gone was the timid girl who once doubted her worth. In her place stood a confident young woman with a radiant smile and a heart full of gratitude. "You've done well," George said softly, patting her hand. "Daniel would have been so proud of you." Emma nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. She knelt down and placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the grave, choosing blooms that reminded her of the vibrant colors in her paintings. As she straightened up, she turned to George. "I wish I could have met him," she admitted quietly. "But knowing about him, learning about the kind of person he was, it's helped me understand myself better. I see pieces of him in me every day." George smiled faintly, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "He lives on through you," he replied, "not just in your talent or your kindness, but in the way you carry yourself, with strength and grace. That's his legacy." For a moment, the three of them, Emma, George, and the memory of Daniel, shared a silent connection, bound together by love and loss. But their peaceful moment was interrupted when they heard footsteps approaching behind them. Turning around, Emma saw Richard walking slowly toward them, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat. His presence surprised her. He rarely accompanied them to the cemetery. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Richard said awkwardly, stopping a few feet away. His voice lacked its old sharpness, replaced by a tone of cautious humility. Emma shook her head, gesturing for him to join them. For a while, no one spoke. The four of them simply stood there, united by shared history and unspoken emotions. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "I came here to say, I'm sorry. To both of you." He looked at Emma first, then at George. "I know I haven't been the father, or the son, you deserved. I let my pain cloud everything, and I pushed people away instead of leaning on them. I can't change the past, but I want to try to do better moving forward." Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. Over the years, Richard had made small efforts to repair their relationship, but this apology felt monumental. She stepped forward and hugged him tightly, surprising even herself. When she pulled back, she saw tears in his eyes, something she had never witnessed before. As they left the cemetery together, Emma couldn't help but reflect on how far they had all come. Her journey hadn't been easy, but it had taught her invaluable lessons about forgiveness, resilience, and the power of truth. She carried those lessons with her wherever she went, letting them guide her as she pursued her dreams. Today, Emma was thriving. Her artwork had gained recognition beyond her hometown, earning her opportunities to showcase her talent in galleries across the country. Yet, despite her success, she remained grounded, always remembering where she came from and who she came from. Daniel's memory inspired her daily, reminding her to live boldly and authentically. Back home, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting warm hues over the house, Emma sat with George and Richard in the living room. The walls were adorned with her paintings, each piece telling a story of growth and healing. Laughter filled the air, a sound that had once seemed impossible in their home. Though scars remained, love and understanding had begun to mend what was once broken. Emma realized that life wasn't about erasing the past. It was about finding beauty in the broken pieces and building something new. And as she looked around at the family she had fought so hard to heal, she knew they were finally heading in the right direction. Together, months passed, and Emma's life began to transform in ways she had once only dreamed of. The anger and self-doubt that had weighed her down for so long slowly gave way to confidence and purpose. With her grandfather George by her side, she embraced her newfound identity and discovered strengths she never knew she possessed. Her artwork became more than just a hobby. It was a way for her to express herself, to tell the story of who she was without needing anyone else's approval. One sunny afternoon, Emma stood in front of an easel in her room, brushing bold strokes of color onto a large canvas. This piece was different from anything she created before. It was vibrant and alive, filled with swirling shades of blue, green, and gold. In the center of the painting stood two figures, a man and a woman holding hands, their faces blurred but unmistakably happy. To Emma, they represented her parents, Daniel and her mom, whose love had shaped the foundation of her existence. She titled the painting *Legacy*, hoping it would remind her that she carried their strength and kindness within her. When the painting was finished, Emma decided to share it with Richard. She wasn't sure how he would react, but she felt ready to take the risk. That evening, she placed the canvas on the dining table, waiting nervously as he entered the room. For a moment, he simply stared at the painting, his expression unreadable. Then quietly, he said, "This is good, really good." His voice lacked its usual sharpness, replaced instead by something softer, almost tender. Emma smiled, relief washing over her. "Thanks," she replied softly. "It's about them, Mom and Dad. I wanted to honor them somehow." Richard nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the figures in the painting. After a pause, he added, "You're talented, Emma. You always have been. I didn't see it before." It wasn't a full apology, but it was enough. Enough to show that he was trying, however imperfectly, to understand her. The therapy sessions continued to help bridge the gap between them. They weren't perfect. There were still moments of tension and awkward silences, but both Emma and Richard were learning to communicate in ways they hadn't before. Richard admitted during one session that he had resented Emma not because of anything she had done, but because of the pain he associated with losing Daniel. "I let my grief turn into bitterness," he confessed reluctantly, avoiding eye contact. "And I took it out on you. That wasn't fair." Emma listened silently, processing his words. She didn't forgive him completely right away. It wasn't that simple, but she appreciated his honesty. It was a step toward healing, even if the journey was far from over. Outside of therapy, Emma found joy in new experiences. She joined an art club at school, where she met other students who shared her passion. For the first time, she felt like she belonged somewhere, like she had friends who truly understood her. Her teachers noticed the change too. She participated more in class discussions, raised her hand confidently, and even volunteered to lead a group project. The girl who had once shrunk under her father's criticism was now standing tall, unafraid to shine. As spring approached, Emma submitted her artwork to a regional youth art exhibition. She didn't expect much, telling herself that participating was reward enough. But when the results came back, she learned that she had won first place in her category. Standing on stage to accept her award, she felt a sense of pride unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Looking out at the audience, she spotted George sitting proudly in the front row, clapping enthusiastically. Beside him sat Richard, his face solemn but his eyes reflecting a quiet admiration. That night, as they celebrated her achievement at home, Emma realized how far they had all come. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but for the first time, she believed they could navigate it together. She had rediscovered her roots, built a legacy of her own, and begun to heal the wounds of the past. And though challenges lay ahead, Emma knew she was strong enough to face them, with or without Richard's support. Through every triumph and struggle, Emma proved to herself that she was worthy of love, respect, and happiness. Her journey wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving, no matter the odds. In the days that followed the confrontation, the atmosphere in the house shifted subtly but noticeably. The air no longer felt as heavy, though it was far from light. Emma noticed small changes in Richard's behavior. He didn't criticize her as often, and there were moments when he seemed lost in thought, staring out the window with a distant look in his eyes. For the first time, she saw cracks in the armor of the man who had always appeared invincible. It wasn't redemption or transformation, but it was a start. George became Emma's anchor during this turbulent period. He spent hours talking to her about Daniel, sharing stories that painted a vivid picture of the father she never got to meet. "Your dad loved music," George told her one evening as they sat together on the porch. "He used to play the guitar and sing silly songs just to make people laugh. You have his creativity, you know." Hearing these details made Emma feel closer to Daniel, like pieces of him lived on through her. But perhaps the biggest change came within Emma herself. Knowing the truth about her family gave her a newfound sense of identity. She stopped blaming herself for Richard's harshness and began to see her own worth more clearly. Her mother's journal, filled with words of encouragement and dreams for her future, became a source of strength. One entry stood out. "No matter what happens, I want you to know that you are enough. Just being yourself is your greatest gift to the world." Those words echoed in her mind whenever self-doubt crept in. With George's support, Emma decided to try something she'd been too afraid to pursue before: art. She had always loved drawing and painting, but had kept it hidden because Richard dismissed creative hobbies as frivolous. Now, she bought a sketchbook and some paints, spending hours experimenting with colors and shapes. At first, her work was rough and unpolished, but over time, her confidence grew. Each stroke of the brush felt like reclaiming a part of herself that she had buried long ago. One afternoon, as she worked on a vibrant landscape painting, Richard walked into the living room where she had set up her supplies. She tensed, expecting criticism, but instead, he simply stood there, studying the canvas. After a moment, he said gruffly, "You're not bad at this." It wasn't high praise, but coming from him, it meant something. Emma smiled faintly and thanked him, feeling a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could improve between them. To further mend their fractured relationship, George suggested family therapy sessions. At first, Richard resisted, insisting they didn't need outsiders meddling in private matters. But Emma persisted, explaining calmly how much it would mean to her. Eventually, he relented, though reluctantly. The early sessions were awkward and tense, with Richard sitting stiffly while Emma poured out her feelings. Yet, as weeks turned into months, tiny breakthroughs began to happen. Richard admitted, albeit haltingly, that he regretted some of the things he had said and done. He still struggled to express emotions openly, but his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes was progress nonetheless. Meanwhile, Emma continued to grow in ways she hadn't imagined. Her artwork gained attention at school, and she entered a local art competition on a whim. To her surprise, she won second place. Standing on stage to accept her award, she felt a rush of pride, not because of the trophy, but because she had proven to herself that she was capable of achieving something meaningful. When she returned home that evening, she found Richard waiting in the living room. Without saying a word, he took her painting and hung it prominently on the wall. It was a silent gesture, but it spoke volumes. Though forgiveness didn't come easily, Emma realized that healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about finding a way to move forward together. With George's wisdom guiding her and her own resilience pushing her forward, she began to see glimmers of light breaking through the shadows of their complicated family history. The next morning, Emma woke up with a mixture of determination and nervousness swirling in her chest. She had spent hours the previous night reading through her mother's journal, each page bringing her closer to understanding the people who had shaped her existence. The entries were filled with love for Daniel, love for their dreams, and most importantly, love for her. Her mother's words painted a vivid picture of hope and resilience, even in the face of unimaginable loss. But now, armed with the truth, Emma knew she couldn't keep it hidden any longer. It was time to confront Richard. Breakfast was unusually quiet that day. Richard sat at the table, sipping his coffee while skimming through the newspaper. He glanced up briefly when Emma entered but quickly returned his attention to the headlines. She hesitated for a moment, gathering her courage, then cleared her throat. "Dad," she began, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "We need to talk." Richard lowered the newspaper slightly, raising an eyebrow. "About what?" he asked, his tone indifferent. Emma took a deep breath and placed the birth certificate on the table in front of him. "This is about the fact that you're not my biological father," she said firmly, watching his expression closely. For a split second, Richard froze, his eyes widening as they darted between Emma and the document. Then, just as quickly, his face hardened into a mask of denial. "What nonsense are you talking about now?" he snapped, pushing the paper away. "Where did you get this? Are you making up stories because you can't handle criticism?" Emma shook her head, refusing to back down. "It's not nonsense, Dad. Grandpa showed me everything last night. The letters, the photos, the journal. You agreed to raise me after Daniel died, but you've treated me like I'm some kind of burden ever since. Why? Because I remind you of him." Richard's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked like he might explode with anger. But before he could respond, George appeared in the doorway, holding the wooden box from the attic. His presence commanded silence, and both Emma and Richard turned to look at him. "I think it's time we stopped hiding the truth," George said calmly, walking over to the table. He opened the box and laid out the evidence one by one. The photographs of Daniel, the letters between her parents, and finally, the official documents proving Daniel's role as Emma's father. "You can deny it all you want, Richard, but these don't lie." At first, Richard tried to brush it off, accusing them of fabricating lies or misunderstanding the situation. But as George continued presenting undeniable proof, his defenses began to crumble. He stared at the items on the table, his hands trembling as he reached for the photograph of Daniel and Emma's mother. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, his face unreadable. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh, slumping back in his chair. "Fine," he muttered bitterly. "Yes, Daniel was your father. Yes, I stepped in to raise you. But none of that changes the fact that you've been nothing but a disappointment." Emma flinched at his words, but George stepped in firmly. "That's enough, Richard," he said, his voice sharp yet controlled. "Emma isn't responsible for your pain. You chose to take it out on her instead of facing your own grief. And now, it's time you started taking responsibility for your actions." The room fell silent, the weight of the conversation pressing down on everyone. Richard avoided eye contact, staring blankly at the table. It was clear that the confrontation had shaken him, forcing him to confront years of buried guilt and resentment. Though he didn't apologize outright, the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly, as if a small crack had formed in the wall he had built around himself. Emma felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and even a flicker of pity. She realized that Richard wasn't just a villain in her story. He was also a victim of his own inability to heal. As painful as it was, she decided to give him a chance, not for his sake, but for hers. If she wanted to move forward, she needed to find a way to break the cycle of hurt that had defined their relationship for so long. And though the road ahead wouldn't be easy, Emma knew one thing for certain. She was no longer willing to carry the burden of someone else's pain. As Emma sat in the dusty attic, surrounded by fragments of a past she never knew existed, her mind raced to make sense of everything. The photograph of Daniel, her real father, still clutched in her hands, seemed to glow with warmth despite its faded edges. George continued sorting through the items in the chest, pulling out more letters and documents that painted a clearer picture of the life her parents had shared. "Your father, Daniel, was an incredible man," George said softly, his voice tinged with both pride and sorrow. He handed Emma another photo, this one showing Daniel laughing as he held a tiny baby wrapped in a soft blanket. "That's you," he added with a gentle smile. "You were his whole world. He used to talk about all the things he wanted to teach you. how to ride a bike, how to fish, how to dream big. Emma traced the image with her fingers, imagining what it would have been like to grow up with a father who looked at her with such love instead of disdain. But the joy of discovering this connection was shadowed by the weight of knowing she'd never get to meet him. Her eyes filled with tears again, but George didn't stop talking. He wanted her to understand the full story, no matter how painful it might be. He and your mother were inseparable, George continued. They balanced each other perfectly. She was practical and grounded, while he was spontaneous and full of ideas. Together, they dreamed of building a family, a happy, loving home. He paused, pulling out a bundle of handwritten letters tied together with a frayed ribbon. These are letters they wrote to each other when they were apart. They'll show you just how much they cared for one another. Emma untied the ribbon carefully and unfolded one of the letters. The handwriting was neat and elegant, filled with words of affection and plans for the future. One line stood out. When we're together, I feel like anything is possible. With you by my side, our little girl will have the best life anyone could ask for. Her heart ached as she read it, realizing how close she had come to having that life, and how cruelly it had been taken away. But George wasn't done yet. He reached into the chest once more and pulled out an official-looking document, a birth certificate. Handing it to Emma, he pointed to the section labeled Father. There, written in bold ink, was the name Daniel Harper *. It was undeniable proof of her true lineage. For a moment, Emma felt a surge of anger, not just toward Richard for keeping this secret, but also toward fate for robbing her of the chance to know Daniel and her mother. Why did Richard agree to raise me if he hated being reminded of Daniel so much? Emma asked, her voice trembling. It doesn't make sense. George sighed heavily, leaning back against the old wooden beam behind him. At first, I think he genuinely wanted to help. Losing Daniel hit him hard, and maybe taking care of you gave him a way to cope with the grief. But over time, the pain turned into bitterness. He started seeing you not as a person, but as a symbol of everything he had lost. And instead of dealing with his emotions, he pushed them onto you. Emma nodded slowly, piecing it all together. Richard's harshness, his constant criticism, it wasn't because she wasn't good enough. It was because he couldn't face his own guilt and regret. She felt a strange mix of pity and frustration toward him. But most of all, she felt relief. Relief that his disapproval wasn't a reflection of her worth. Relief that she finally knew the truth. There's something else, George said, his tone growing quieter. He pulled out a small journal, its cover worn from years of use. This belonged to your mother. She wrote in it every day after Daniel passed away. It's filled with thoughts about raising you, memories of him, and hopes for your future. If you want, you can read it. It might help you feel closer to her. Emma took the journal hesitantly, running her fingers over the smooth leather. She didn't open it right away. The weight of holding something so personal made her pause. But deep down, she knew this was a gift, a way to connect with the parents she had lost, and to rediscover who she truly was. For the first time in years, Emma felt a spark of hope. The secrets buried in the attic weren't just pieces of the past. They were keys to unlocking her identity and finding strength in the legacy left behind by those who loved her most. Emma hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with questions. What did her grandfather mean by the truth? Was it something about her father, about their family, or maybe even about herself? She had so many doubts swirling in her head, but one thing was clear. George's tone was serious, and his eyes carried a weight that she had never seen before. Taking a deep breath, she nodded and followed him silently. He led her up the narrow staircase to the attic, a part of the house Emma rarely visited. The attic was dimly lit, with sunlight streaming through tiny cracks in the wooden shutters. Dust particles floated lazily in the air, and the scent of old wood and forgotten memories filled the space. In the corner stood an ancient wooden chest, its surface scratched and worn from years of use. George walked over to it, knelt down, and carefully lifted the lid. Inside the chest was a treasure trove of memories. Stacks of yellowed letters tied with string, faded photographs in frames, and documents wrapped in protective sheets. Emma's curiosity grew as she watched her grandfather sift through the items with care, his hands trembling slightly. He picked up a framed photograph first and handed it to her. It showed a young man with warm eyes and a bright smile, standing beside a woman who looked strikingly familiar. "That's your mother," George said softly, pointing to the woman in the picture. Then he gestured to the man beside her. "And this is Daniel, your real father." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She stared at the photo, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. Her real father. But Richard had always been the only dad she'd ever known. Confusion turned into disbelief, and she looked up at George, searching his face for answers. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. George sighed deeply, as if bracing himself for the story he was about to tell. He pulled out a stack of letters and began explaining. "Daniel was my youngest son, your father. He was kind, talented, and full of life. You have his eyes, you know." A faint smile crossed his face, but it quickly faded. "He met your mother when they were both in college. They fell in love, got married, and had you. But tragedy struck soon after. Daniel died in a car accident just months after you were born." Emma felt a lump form in her throat. She had always wondered about her biological father, but she never imagined the truth would be so painful. "Then, what about Richard?" she asked, her voice shaky. George paused, looking down at the letters in his hands. "After Daniel passed away, your mother was devastated. She didn't think she could raise you alone. So Richard stepped in. He wasn't your father by blood, but he agreed to take responsibility for you. At first, I thought it was a noble act, but over time," his voice trailed off, heavy with regret. "Over time, resentment built up inside him. He resented the reminder of Daniel, of the brother he lost. And instead of dealing with his pain, he took it out on you." Emma's hands trembled as she held the photograph. Everything suddenly made sense. The constant criticism, the harsh words, the impossible standards. Richard hadn't been trying to push her to succeed. He had been punishing her for something she had no control over. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but this time, they weren't tears of self-doubt. They were tears of clarity. "Why didn't anyone tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I wanted to protect you," George admitted, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But I see now that keeping these secrets has only caused more harm. You deserve to know where you come from, and who you really are." As they sat together amidst the relics of the past, Emma felt a strange mix of emotions: sadness for the family she never knew, anger at the lies she had lived with, but also a flicker of hope. For the first time, she realized that her worth wasn't defined by Richard's approval. She had a legacy of her own, a father who loved her enough to leave behind a lifetime of happy memories, even if she couldn't remember them herself. George placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "There's more you need to understand," he said gently. "But for now, let this sink in. You're not alone, Emma. Not anymore." One evening, the tension in the house reached a boiling point. It was supposed to be a regular family dinner, a quiet meal where everyone ate in near silence, avoiding eye contact as much as possible. The only sounds were the clinking of forks against plates and the occasional sigh from Richard. Emma had spent hours preparing for this moment, determined to show her father that she was capable of doing something right. She had cleaned the dining table, set out the best dishes, and even attempted to cook his favorite meal: spaghetti with meatballs. Her hands trembled as she carried the steaming plate to the table, praying it would meet his approval. For a brief moment, hope flickered inside her. Richard took a bite, chewed slowly, and nodded slightly. Maybe tonight would be different, she thought. Maybe he'd finally see how hard she worked to please him. But then, without warning, his expression darkened. "This is too salty," he said coldly, pushing the plate away. Didn't I teach you anything about seasoning? You can't even get something as simple as this right." Emma's heart sank. She opened her mouth to apologize. But before she could speak, Richard continued. "And what about your grades? I saw your report card today. C- in math. Seriously, do you have any idea how embarrassing that is for me?" His voice grew louder with each word, echoing through the small dining room. George sat quietly at the end of the table, his eyes fixed on his plate, pretending not to hear the argument unfolding before him. But Emma felt like the entire world was watching and judging. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision. She wanted to explain that she'd been struggling with math all semester, that she stayed after school for extra help, and that she was trying her hardest. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she muttered a soft, "I'm sorry," and stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Without another glance at her father, she rushed upstairs, slamming the door to her bedroom behind her. Once alone, Emma collapsed onto her bed, burying her face in her pillow to muffle her sobs. Why did he always find fault in everything she did? Didn't he realize how much effort she put into pleasing him? The question swirled in her mind, leaving her more confused and hurt than ever. After a while, she reached for her notebook, the same one she used to write letters to her late mother. With trembling hands, she began pouring out her feelings onto the page. "Dear Mom," she wrote, "I don't know why Dad hates me so much. No matter what I do, it's never good enough. Sometimes I think he wishes I wasn't here at all. Is it my fault? Am I really as useless as he says I am?" As she wrote, tears dripped onto the paper, smudging some of the ink. But writing helped ease the ache in her chest, if only a little. She didn't notice the faint creak of the hallway floorboards or the soft knock on her door. It wasn't until she heard her grandfather's gentle voice calling her name that she realized someone had been listening. "Emma," George said softly, stepping into the room. "May I come in?" She wiped her eyes quickly and nodded, embarrassed that he might have overheard her crying. George closed the door behind him and sat down on the edge of her bed. For a man who rarely spoke, his presence was oddly comforting. He looked at her with kind, knowing eyes, and for the first time in years, Emma felt like someone truly saw her. "You deserve better than this," he said simply, placing a hand on hers. "It's time you knew the truth, not just about your father, but about yourself." Emma stared at him, her heart pounding. What truth could he possibly mean? Before she could ask, George stood up and gestured for her to follow him. "Come with me," he said. "There are things you need to understand." Curiosity mixed with fear as Emma followed her grandfather out of the room. Whatever he wanted to show her, she couldn't shake the feeling that it would change everything. In a quiet little town surrounded by rolling hills and tall oak trees, there lived a teenage girl named Emma. She was shy, gentle, and had a heart full of dreams, but life hadn't been kind to her. Her days were filled with struggles that most people couldn't see from the outside. To everyone else, she seemed like an ordinary teenager, quiet in school, polite to neighbors, and always keeping to herself. But behind closed doors, things were far from ordinary. Emma's father, Richard, was a man who carried himself with authority. He was tall, stern, and always dressed sharply for work. People often admired his discipline and success, but they didn't know the side of him that came out at home. For as long as Emma could remember, her father had treated her harshly. He would criticize everything she did, no matter how hard she tried. Whether it was her grades, her clothes, or even the way she spoke, nothing seemed good enough for him. "You're just not living up to your potential," he'd say over and over again, his voice sharp enough to cut through her confidence like a knife. Her mother had passed away when she was very young, leaving Emma alone with Richard and her grandfather, George. Losing her mom had been devastating, but what made it worse was the emptiness that followed. There was no one left to comfort her when her father yelled, no one to tell her she was doing her best. The house felt cold and lonely, despite being shared by 3 people. Richard spent most of his time working late hours, while George stayed in his room, reading books or watching old movies. He rarely said much, but Emma noticed the sadness in his eyes whenever he looked at her. It was as if he wanted to help but didn't know how. Despite her father's constant disapproval, Emma refused to give up. She studied late into the night, hoping to bring home better report cards. She joined clubs at school, thinking maybe making friends would make her dad proud. She even tried cooking dinner once, following a recipe step by step, only to be told the food tasted bland and amateurish. Each failure chipped away at her self-esteem, but she kept going because deep down, she believed that someday, somehow, she'd earn her father's approval. What made it harder was the comparison. Richard often talked about other kids in the neighborhood, the ones who got straight A's, excelled in sports, or played musical instruments flawlessly. Why can't you be more like them? He'd ask, shaking his head in disappointment. Those words stung more than anything else. They echoed in Emma's mind long after he'd left the room, making her question whether she truly was worthless, just as he sometimes implied. But amidst all the negativity, there was one thing that kept Emma grounded: her love for writing. Late at night, when the house grew silent and the world outside fell asleep, she would sit by her bedroom window with a notebook. She wrote letters to her late mother, sharing her thoughts, fears, and hopes. Sometimes she imagined her mom sitting beside her, listening patiently and smiling warmly. Writing became her escape, her safe haven from the storm raging around her. Little did Emma know, someone else in the house was paying attention. Her grandfather, George, may have appeared distant, but he watched everything. He saw the tears Emma wiped away when she thought no one was looking. He heard the muffled sobs coming from her room late at night. And though he never said a word, he carried the weight of their family's secrets, secrets that would soon change everything.